Hey guys, it's Danny. Today we are going to repot my freshly purchased Phalaenopsis orchids, which arrived in this compacted sphagnum moss mess. And I thought, you know what, it's a great opportunity to take you along and talk about transitioning these orchids to a more home-friendly setup, one that is a lot more airy, because these types of orchids are the ones typically that go through the so-called transplant shock, where the roots just don't adapt, die off, rot off, and you're thinking to yourself, well, what have I done? So I want to touch base on a lot of things that have to do with these orchids. Before we start, quick plug to my second channel, MissOrchidGirl Shorts. You guys know on this channel, I like to do seminar type of videos. I like to have a discussion and explain a whole lot of things at once, just like you would when you go to a talk, right? Well, my Shorts channel has much shorter videos, not a whole lot of explanation, but still good tips as much as possible for those of you who don't really have time. So if you fall in that category, check my Shorts channel down below in the description. And of course, as for this video, don't forget to give it a like if you end up enjoying it. And why not subscribe? I post seminar-style videos and practical approach to stuff multiple times a week. Right, so with that said, let's start with the beginning. We first need to soak these orchids because sphagnum moss is a headache and a half to remove when it's dry. And it can be a lot more damaging to the roots, contributing to transplant shock and root damage. So I'm just going to soak these orchids for about 5-10 minutes or so. Alright, so have you ever had an orchid that you just repotted simply lose all of its roots, start to dehydrate, and you cannot figure out why? Well, one of the possible reasons is the so-called transplant shock. You see, orchid roots tend to adapt very, very well to the type of environment they grow in. In my experience, the older they are, the more adapted to this environment they become and the less adaptable to other newer types of environments. Now, this is a very good evolutionary trait. Naturally, roots take advantage of everything their environment gives them. Being that Phalaenopsis and many orchids we grow are epiphytic, their roots are free to roam the tree. Some of them will grow on the dry side of the tree, the side that has more light. Others might grow on the side that is more humid because it doesn't receive as much sunlight. Maybe on that side we have some mosses as well. So naturally, the same orchid can have both roots adapted and specialized in drier conditions and roots more adapted to more humid conditions. Now, consider cultivation. If all of the roots or most of the roots grow in a certain type of environment, in our case, a more humid environment because of the sphagnum moss, imagine all of a sudden trying to make them grow and flourish in a drier environment, especially the old roots. They will have a shock because they cannot adapt like in 1 second. It takes them a lot of time to adapt to a certain type of environment, and it can take them a lot of time to try and adapt to a totally different environment. Some of them will just not make it. So this is why sometimes we just have all sorts of dying roots without explanation. Chances are we are trying to grow them in a very, very different environment, which includes all of the factors in the air, but also the environment in the pot. So what is the solution? Should we go back to the same type of setup? No, not necessarily, because this certainly does not fit in all of our living rooms, right? What I've discovered along the years actually helps out is a gradual type of transition to a new type of environment. Yes, maybe not all roots will make it, but I did actually have cases in which, if not all the roots, but most of the roots actually made it, even the older ones. I just had to be gradual myself with how I provided the conditions, which, you know what? It's not as hard as you might think. And that's what I'm gonna show you today. That's what we're gonna do. So what I'm doing now is removing all of the sphagnum moss in between the roots. And this particular orchid doesn't have a whole lot of roots, so it's not gonna take a lot of time. Phalaenopsis are generally easy to detangle because they don't have very thin roots. But it is important to remove all of the sphagnum moss because it is old at this point. The orchid was actually placed in this tiny little pot when it was much smaller than this, when it had much less roots. And because of this, there are cases in which you will have Phalaenopsis with many more roots than this. Case in which, if you struggle to remove the sphagnum moss, what you can do is get a pair of tweezers. I have some aquarium tweezers here, they're very good, and just go in between the roots and remove the pieces of sphagnum moss. It wasn't the case here, but I do have a more elaborate video on this if you feel like watching. You can find it linked down below. Typically with other orchids with thinner roots, long-nosed tweezers are saviors. Okay, so we removed all of the sphagnum moss. It is time to remove also the dead roots. If you see any dried or mushy roots, just cut them away. In this way, we're gonna avoid spoiling the new medium faster. And I'm gonna remove some dried bits, old leaf remains, and there we go. The next thing that I will do is give the root system a good rinse at the sink, and we are pretty much done. In the case of Phalaenopsis, I don't usually use hydrogen peroxide 3% because I've never seen snails on Phalaenopsis. Maybe they're not very yummy. And also, in setups with very compacted sphagnum moss, not even snails fit. So I'm pretty sure I don't need to use it. The potting mix that I will choose will not be as water retentive. It will be a sort of medium water retentive mixture with bark and sphagnum moss. Obviously, some of you might choose to go all bark, which will be even airier. Depending what works better in your environment, you should choose the stuff that works better. But because we are switching from that very, very water retentive medium to this one, there is a chance these roots will really not appreciate it. So let's go ahead and prepare the mixture like I always do and tell you how I'm gonna manage the situation. So sphagnum moss at the bottom, gonna place my orchid inside, bark layers in between. And top off with bark layer. In the cases in which you are switching from sphagnum moss to only bark, no sphagnum moss, the transition will have to be even harsher. Right, so I'm pretty much done with potting. In order to make the roots think they're in the same place, what I need to do is maintain this setup just a little bit more moist for a little while and then gradually reduce the level of moisture to, let's say, normal levels for how I like to grow my orchids. So first and foremost, for about a month, I'm not going to let this pot dry out. I'm gonna keep a little bit of an eye on it, and whenever I see that the sphagnum moss is almost dry, maybe I can still see some condensation, that's when I'm going to water the pot. I'm not going to let the roots completely dry out and stay dry for many days, even though generally speaking, Phalaenopsis definitely can handle this. And this is how I'm growing the rest of my Phalaenopsis. I like to let them thoroughly dry out in between waterings. This prolongs the life of my medium as well. But I cannot do this with my new orchid because it will send it into shock. After about a month or so, I'm gonna start to gradually put it on a normal watering schedule. In about a month's time or so, I should have brand new root tips. Whether the existing roots continue growth or they branch out, I will have new roots. New roots trigger sap flow. So the orchid will push nutrients in that area to continue growth of the roots. Well, it is in this time that I observe the older roots become, how should I put this, more adaptable or less prone to just give up on everything. Now, the new roots that form, they will adapt to whatever environment I keep in here. The old roots will have to tag along pretty much. I'm not 100% sure how the science works with this, but this is what happens in my experience. The first month, I'm gonna keep the old roots comfortable, how they know life was. But then when they start to grow new root tips, it is time for the change. And that works for me every time. New roots adapted to the new environment, older roots have no choice, they tag along. Maybe that sap flow triggers some readaptability mechanisms in the roots, but that is my experience. So that's what I'm gonna do with this orchid. I'm gonna go water it, I'm gonna repot this one too, and we're gonna talk a little bit about why nurseries choose these types of setups that give us headaches. Okay, so if this is a bit of a headache, particularly for beginner orchid growers, why do nurseries insist in using these same setups that are a little bit tricky to work with? Well, think about it this way. The nursery doesn't really know who will eventually own these orchids. You can choose to grow your orchids mounted, or in a terrarium, or on your tree in a tropical region, or in a living room in North America. I don't know. Hundreds of scenarios, right? So this setup is just one of the possible setups in which you can grow orchids. And yes, there are people who grow their Phalaenopsis in pure sphagnum moss, which is absolutely great. So because in the end, you don't really know how these orchids will end up and how you will grow them, the nursery will just use the setup that works best for it. And this setup works very well because it is economical. It doesn't imply you using multiple types of potting mixtures. And also, it helps stabilize orchids in pots because these guys are typically potted directly in a more compacted sphagnum moss medium. And this is because you want to keep them from wiggling. Wiggling is never good, particularly if you move them around the nursery on automated bands, depending on each nursery. You don't want them to fall out of the pot. So rather than using the stakes and whatever other things we use in cultivation, just compact a little bit the sphagnum moss. And with the sphagnum moss, it's easy to stabilize plants because it can compact quite a lot. Now, it's not as compacted as to completely suffocate the roots, but the problem is in time, you can see these roots will grow a lot. So what they will do is pretty much take the air pockets and compact the sphagnum moss even more. You're putting in roots and taking out air pockets pretty much, and that's when problems start. But typically, that's when orchids get sold anyway, so the nursery doesn't really have problems. But this is a very economical way for the nursery to grow their orchids. And the more economical they grow their orchids, the more affordable, theoretically, the orchids should be as well. We're not paying 200 euros for these orchids, right? That's great. There are plants which do cost 200 euros. But orchids typically are under, which is a good thing. So I'm personally not bothered by the setup, but I kind of had to learn ways to avoid the repercussions of it, which are very, very real. This orchid is a lot more compacted because it grew more roots, do you see? So I'm gonna take my time and remove this sphagnum moss, and we're gonna do the exact same thing. And I'll tell you what to do in case you do have a serious case of root loss. Okay, before we move on, let me just show you something that I noticed on this orchid. Do you see this little black spot here? It is not a leaf remain, it is in the actual stem. That's a little concerning because I'm not sure if it's active. Sadly though, this is one of those cases where there's nothing I can do about it. Whatever I will do will pretty much be useless. First of all, I cannot treat it with hydrogen peroxide or anything because this is already an advanced ailment. Whatever is going on is already quite deep in the stem. It's not a superficial thing that I can disinfect or sanitize in any way. So my hydrogen peroxide will pretty much stay here. It will not go anywhere deeper. And if the deeper layers are affected, hydrogen peroxide will do pretty much nothing. That's first. Second, the thing that actually works in these cases is removing the affected part, cutting into good tissue, which is more risky than letting it be, to be fully honest, because this is the stem we're talking about. If I make a wound here and it gets infected with pathogens, it's not good at all. So I'm not gonna take my chances because there is a chance the orchid already sealed off this infection, whatever it was. My only hope is that it's not active and the defense mechanisms of the orchid took care of it. So yeah, scooping this area out will probably create more damage. So I'm not gonna do anything about it and we'll see how this works out. All right, so what happens if you do end up with root loss after a repot? Well, the first thing you need to do is remove the orchid from the pot and cut away all of the dead mushy roots. If you leave them be, they will spoil the new medium much faster, making it acidic and very unfriendly for the new roots. I forgot to cut a root here. Second, what I like to do is pretty much just put them back in the pot. Maybe reuse the medium if it's not very old and it's salvageable, or if it's not salvageable, just use brand new medium and wait it out. Eventually the orchid will create brand new roots. It is scheduled to want to survive, so that's what it will try to do. It might go through a period of dehydration, which is very normal, but in the end it should be okay. And if you're lucky enough to have a few roots that are still functioning and absorbing water, you should have pretty much a fully functioning orchid within a few months. I have a video in which you can see me revive some very dehydrated orchids that have very few roots, if at all. I don't remember. I'll link you to it down below. You can see their evolution over about a month's time and how I went about it. of course, depending on the case, you might want to create a sort of ICU type of a setup, which again, I have a video explaining it more. Depends for me as well. I don't put all of my orchids in ICU because some of them just don't need it, but there are some orchids which really could use close contact with the sphagnum moss because they're already depleted. So for those, I do a little bit of an ICU, but for most of them, I just repot them and take care of them, go through the little bit of dehydration that will happen, and it's normal to happen. And most of the orchids will start to produce new roots on their own in the first couple of months or so. I am not the type that uses all sorts of root enhancing boosters and things of the sort. So if I don't use them, I cannot insist on you using them either. It's gonna be like lying to you pretty much. And I don't lie to you. I never lie. I'm brutally honest actually, and that's not always good, but still, I don't use any of those boosting products, not even from rePotme, and I love rePotme, and we've been partnered for 4 years at this point. I don't use those products because I don't believe in them. Doesn't mean they don't work? No, maybe they do work. I just don't think they do. So what you see me use are the stuff that I do actually use. And the stuff that I'm comfortable telling you, yeah, it's good, it's great, it's fun, do it, it's nice, but stuff that I don't use, I'm not gonna tell you to use. And I know it's tricky to just wait for an orchid to produce roots without doing anything because you feel like you're actually not helping it. But you are helping it by providing a good environment, good temperature, good light, making sure that the potting mix is nice and fresh. You know, you do a lot for your orchid. You don't have to put all sorts of substances on it for it to be happy. At least that is my philosophy, and that is what I preach here on this channel. Now let's talk a little bit about the pot size, because it's a thing that, especially for beginners, it kind of matters. You can control the amount of moisture in a pot using the pot size. The bigger the pot, theoretically, the more moisture it can retain. Obviously, this doesn't apply if you are comparing a pot full of sphagnum moss with a pot full of bark. Even if the pot with bark is larger than the pot full of sphagnum moss, the sphagnum moss will stay more moist than the other one. So obviously, context matters, but generally, given the same type of mixture, a bigger pot can stay more moist. So if what you need is to retain moisture, maybe a bigger pot will help you out in this transition. However, the opposite, if you need a drier environment rather than moist, definitely pot size can help you out. For example, if you want to transition a mounted orchid, which pretty much grew in the air, to a potted situation, if you know you can't really make the mixture to help you out much, you can play around with the pot size as well, provided the roots fit. So maybe if you want to keep it safe with transitioning a mounted orchid, go for the tiniest pot that you can, and that will help you out. If you trust in your abilities to control the moisture with your watering technique and regime, then, forget what I said. Personally, my policy on tiny pots versus big pots, it doesn't matter because I can control moisture in different ways. Hence why my mini orchids that I recently purchased, and they came in tiny little pots, went directly into the bigger pots. These guys grow too fast for me to bother with tiny pots. This one is spiking again. The same regimen will go for this one as well. I'm gonna keep it more on the moist side for a little while and then slowly and surely put it on the normal watering regimen that all of my other orchids have. We have a flower spike here. Hopefully it's gonna bloom. And yeah, I'll keep you up to date with that blackened patch there. And we are done. I was thinking, how about whenever I do one of these like seminar type of videos, maybe I can extract snippets from this video and make them like 1-2 minute snippets of a particular story. For example, how I talked about that black patch right there, right? If you would not watch the entire video, this video, you wouldn't necessarily learn about how to deal with those types of patches, and maybe that it's best to leave them alone, right? I know some of you just don't watch the entire video. That's okay. Maybe I can extract that little discussion that I did there, put it on the Shorts channel as a snippet with its own title, because I'm sure at some point, maybe somebody will search, what is this black patch on the stem? What do I do about it? So maybe I can do something like that. Let me know. Do you think it's a good idea to get the snippets from my seminars and put them on the Source channel, because I can totally do that. And yeah, with that said, I will keep you up to date. I see that this one is starting to produce some buds here. I'm hoping it's gonna start blooming again. It has a little branch here as well. This one is the white and yellow one. I want to see it in bloom so badly. I cannot wait. So yeah, that's about it. I'll keep you up to date. Don't forget to visit the Source channel, but if you want to keep in touch with me on other social media, just search for me. I'm at MissOrchidGirl pretty much everywhere. Most importantly though, do subscribe to this channel so that you are notified whenever I post something new. And with that said, I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you next time. Bye!